All right, Daniel chapter 3, famous story, and it's a long story, and we're going to take several weeks to work through it because there's so much here. So Daniel chapter 3, this evening we'll look at the first 6 verses. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then here's the list again: the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Now on your outline, I put the word status by mistake. That should be statue. Blame my poor proofreading, but the idea there, just to kind of translate it into modern terms, the Bible says that this statue was 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide. Roughly, that works out to 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. And you notice when you read the story, it's actually built out on a plain. And verse 1 talks about this plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So when you talk about Babylon, Babylon is both a nation, Babylonia it was called, and a city, kind of like New York. There's New York the state and New York the city. Same idea here. And so this statue is not built in the city of Babylon, it's built out in the countryside. And there's been a lot of speculation as to why Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't have built it in the city. And most scholars think that probably it was because even though 90 feet tall is pretty impressive, Babylon was famous for buildings that were much taller. And so if you'd have been walking around Babylon and you saw the statue, you would have been amazing. You know, it's made of gold, right? But you'd had to look for it. You'd had to know where to go. Whereas by building it out in the country on this flat plain, it would have been really, really impressive. Somebody coming up over, there was kind of a hill in the distance, and you would come down and you would see this golden statue in the distance. And the other thing that's interesting, there's a lot of debate over exactly how it was built, whether it was actually solid gold or just covered with gold. But a lot of people have said very likely that this was more gold than had ever been used in one setting before, even if it was just covered with gold. 90 feet tall, 90 feet wide, that's a lot of gold. And so it was an incredibly expensive undertaking. Now, one of the things I grew up thinking, and you guys might feel the same way, I grew up assuming that this statue was a statue of Nebuchadnezzar, right? I grew up being told this was a statue of the king. It looked like him and you would come and bow down to him. But if you read the story, the Bible doesn't actually say that. It just says the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar, or the image he had set up. So it could have been a statue of him, or it could have been a statue of one of the gods that he served. But the point behind it wasn't so much that it was of him, but that he was the one who had it built. And everybody knew that. So even if it wasn't, his face on the statue, everybody knew this was Nebuchadnezzar's statue. And the reason he did it was a representation of his power. And so by coming out to this plain and looking at this statue, anybody that saw it had a clear reminder, this is the man who's in charge. This is the man who's on the top of the food chain. And so you notice in verse 2, he brings a very specific group of people to the dedication. Let's read it again. King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather, now here's the list, the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So these are government officials. These are people that are in charge of all the provinces in Babylon, and they are people with a great deal of power and a great deal of influence. And if Nebuchadnezzar was going to have problems in his kingdom with rebellion or, disloyalty, these are the people who are going to try to rise up against him. And so this helps you understand why he's doing this. He's building this statue, and he's basically demanding that all of his important government officials come out from across everywhere. It would have been, several days travel for many of them, as a test of their loyalty, because they're going to come out, they're going to bow down to the statue, and it's a reminder to them, listen, you've got a lot of power and influence, but your power depends on my power. I'm the king. And so that's what's going on here. This is a test of loyalty, kind of like, hey, are you going to do what you're going to do to prove that you're, on the right side here? Something else to remember. A lot of people have the idea that I said a lot of people. Some people have the idea that this was Nebuchadnezzar establishing maybe a new god, and that this would be the only god people could worship. That wasn't how the Babylonian world worked, or really ancient cultures. Most ancient cultures, including Babylon, not only allowed you to worship multiple gods, they encouraged you, because the feeling was, you better cover your bases, right? So there were different gods for different things. There were gods for fertility. When the crops were coming in and you were waiting for the rain, you prayed to that god. There were gods for all kinds of different issues. If you wanted to have children, you would pray to a certain god. If you wanted success in your business, you would pray to a different god. And so nobody was being required to give up their current god, but by bowing down to this statue, what they were doing, they're saying, okay, we're going to keep our current gods, we're going to keep praying to them, but we're recognizing that King Nebuchadnezzar is the supreme power in the land. They're not necessarily calling him a god, but by bowing down to his statue, they're saying he's the one that we give our loyalty to. And if you didn't, as we already read in verse 6, you'd pay a high price. What does it say? Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And we'll kind of get into that furnace a little bit next time. Now, if you remember, now it's been since Christmas, everything has got mixed up with our Wednesday Bible studies because we've been having all these activities. But if you remember chapter 2, which we looked at probably a month ago now last time, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. You remember that? And he saw a statue there too. Only that one wasn't made of pure gold. It was gold and silver and bronze and then iron and the feet of clay and iron. And he didn't understand the dream. And without going through all of it, essentially Daniel explains to him the meaning of the dream, which is that God is the one in control of human history. That was the point of the dream. And Nebuchadnezzar heard it clearly. Daniel explained it clearly. But now we're in chapter 3. We don't know how much later this is, if it's just a matter of a few years, or we can't really tell. But somehow between hearing the lesson in chapter 2 of his dream and building this statue, Nebuchadnezzar kind of forgot, you know what, God is the one in control, because now he's trying to put himself in that place. But let me read to you what Daniel told him. Daniel chapter 2, verse 20 and the first part of 21. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might." Here we go, verse 21. He changes times and seasons. Now here, he removes kings, God removes kings and sets up kings. And Nebuchadnezzar had heard that. He should have known better. But you know how he was like us? I can hear something and think I'm going to remember it forever. And I have to relearn that lesson a few times. So he's forgetting God's the one in control. And then there's something else interesting that you should know about this statue. It's kind of a fun fact. It was built in the same place as the Tower of Babel. You know of the story in Genesis? Well, and let me read you the references. Let's go back to chapter 3 and reread verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 60 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, it's in your outline. Let's go to Genesis 11. This is the story of the Tower of Babel. Not the whole story, but the beginning. Verse 1, now the whole earth had one language and the same word. So this is after the flood, okay? And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. Now that's how they made bricks, by taking clay and firing it, or putting it in a fire or a kiln to harden it. Let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Now, how do you know that Genesis 11, the plain of Shinar, or the plain in the land of Shinar, is the same place as Daniel 3:1, the plain of Dura? Well, because first of all, Shinar is the ancient name for the land that became Babylon. So it's the same part of the world. And secondly, even today, there's only one plain, significant plain in that land, and it's the plain of Dura. It still exists today. It's a little bit different, but it's a very large, flat area, and that's all it could have been. And so, the exact same place being used for two different events. Now, the purpose, I would argue, and I'd be interested to hear your take on this during discussion, I think the purpose was kind of the same. So in Nebuchadnezzar's story, right, he builds this statue on the plain of Dura, number one, to show his glory, right? I'm the guy in charge. And also what it does, it provides a point of unity for his kingdom. This is the place you go to show your loyalty. And this man that the statue represents, he's the central focus of who we are as a people, right? It's kind of like a temple almost, or a statue to worship, right? Right? In a sense, I think you could make the argument the Tower of Babel was kind of the same. It was an attempt to show the glory of those people. We're going to build a tower that's going to go to the heavens. And it also was an attempt to unify, to give a central focus to their nation. Let's go back and reread verse 4 in Genesis 11. They said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves. Now watch this. Lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So they're kind of doing something like Nebuchadnezzar was doing, a central location. This is going to keep us together. It's going to keep us unified. And so they're building this, in this case, in Nebuchadnezzar's case, a statue. In the case of the Tower of Babel, a tower. But the idea is the same. This is something we're building to show how powerful we are, how much we've achieved, and it's a central place for us to gather together and essentially celebrate ourselves, right? You know, kind of arrogant, but that's kind of how earthly kingdoms are. I remember Cheryl and I, and Gary Jr. and Sarah were the ones. Kaylin hadn't been born yet. We lived in Africa, one of the poorest countries in Africa. Like not, Africa's poor, but this place was really poor. But when we lived there, we found the presidents of the country had a habit of putting up statues of themselves, and you're like, really? and the reason they did it was simple, to remind everybody who was important and who was in charge. And that's just how it is in most nations of the world. There's statues of presidents and generals and all this kind of thing. And it's because a statue is more than just a work of art. A statue is a symbol. I'm not talking about a statue of art. I mean like a statue of a VIP from history, let's say, right? It's a symbol. And have you ever noticed, like if you watch the news, if you're talking about an authoritarian country, let's say Iraq, right? Before the invasion of the U.S., Saddam Hussein had been in charge of that place for years, and all of a sudden the U.S. and the coalition invades, and there's this, and Saddam is defeated. Do you all remember the scene on the TV news of that huge statue being pulled down? Why? Was the statue ugly? It wasn't the aesthetic value. It was that the statue was symbolic. And it's what it represented. And the same thing, the Soviet Union, right? Statues of Lenin and being pulled down. And in our own country, without getting political or getting involved in that, we've had some conflict in our own country about statues, especially in the South, right? And what they represented, and we're going to pull them down. And so it's not the statue that's the issue, it's what it represents. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar's doing. That's why he's having this statue built. He's building a monument to himself as a test of people's allegiance. And he's saying, you need to bow down to this statue and proclaim your loyalty to me. Now, whether we're talking about statues or whatever, that's what the world demands of us. The world system demands our loyalty. And so we talk in this country, let's say, and I'm not going to get political, or I don't intend to get political, but there's a few things that I just want to kind of point out, right? Our nation's system gives us a certain amount of freedom, right? There are certain things in our Constitution that we are guaranteed to be free in these ways. But if you really pay attention, even though we have certain freedoms, they only extend as far as the boundaries that society is allowing at the moment. And so, for example, our Constitution, why is she so cute? So, our Constitution allows us what? Freedom of religion, right? It's in the Constitution, the First Amendment. But have you ever felt yourself under pressure not to exercise that freedom too far? Like at work, or at school, just depending where you're at. People talk about, well, you need to keep your beliefs private, and you don't need to be out talking to everybody about what you believe. You don't need to be sharing your beliefs. There's that pressure, right? And the idea here is that, yeah, you have these freedoms. Yeah, you're allowed to do this, but you got to put God in second place. That's how most societies work. Most societies exalt themselves and their ideas and their values above God. And that's because every society, including a relatively free society like our nation, and I still argue that our nation is the best in the world, because I've lived around the world and I've seen what it's like. But even here, people who are in charge have a goal. They want their way of thinking to become your way of thinking. And by definition, sometimes that means God is in second place in your life because there are some expectations of you that are put upon you. And again, I'm genuinely not trying to get political. I'm talking about how societies work. I'm talking about how the world system works. And this is what Nebuchadnezzar is doing here. He's got all these leaders gathered together on this plain. They're looking at this statue, and he's not telling them, hey, you have to get rid of your existing gods. He's not saying, well, you can't worship your gods. He's just saying, you have to bow down to this statue that represents my authority. I'm going to impose my will on you, and you will obey, or else. In a sense, and I'm going to use a word that's a little bit silly, but I think it fits this. The people he calls in, the government officials, these leaders, I would argue they were the influencers of their day in Babylon. Now, I use that word carefully because for most of us, in fact, when I typed the word influencer in my word processing, it didn't fit with the dictionary. It hasn't been updated yet, so it's a little underlined in red. But I left it in there because it's kind of a new word. Now, when I hear the word influencer, I tend to think of somebody on social media, right? Somebody about you guys' age who's talking about trends and fashions and all that. But the reason they're called influencers is because they have a group of people who listen to them, right? And this is what you ought to be doing. This is what I'm doing. And for the most part, I actually am not concerned about influencers on social media. And I think most of you are probably the same way. You really don't care that much. But just because you don't follow social media influencers doesn't mean you don't have influencers in your life anyway. And that's what I want to get at. We're going to wrap up with this, and we'll have our discussion time. When it comes to what you believe, We all have voices that we listen to. Whether they're on social media is irrelevant. We all have people that we're listening to, and whoever you're listening to is an influencer in your mind and in your heart and in your thinking. And that's where I want to encourage you to be careful, because it's kind of easy to make fun of these goofballs who get on TikTok and Instagram and carry on, and you can see right through it, right? You can come on, get serious. But there are other messages that we hear in different ways that influence us, and they're harder to identify as being manipulative, especially if they are saying what we already want to believe, right? And since I'm talking to Christians, that's kind of my point. I'm not worried about most of you or any of you coming up to me and saying, some dumb thing you heard on Instagram and promoting it as true. I think you're smarter than that. And I think I don't think you're going to bow to the empty idols of this world. But Satan is also smart. Satan is very intelligent. And this is what I want to say. The greatest tactic of the enemy against a Christian is to get you to bow to Nebuchadnezzar's statue without realizing what you're doing. It's easy to laugh at somebody on TikTok who's goofy and extreme, right? But there are other voices that seem so logical, seem so right, and maybe they're not. And Satan's been doing it for so long, he's become good at it. 2 Corinthians 11:14, no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So, if you're listening to what someone is telling you, here's a couple questions, and I put them in your outline, that you could ask yourself. Is this person telling me the truth, or is he just telling me what I want to hear? Number two, are these ideas based on biblical principles, or are they just appealing to my personal bias? And be honest in the way you answer that, because it is easy to be deceived by something that sounds right and sounds good, but may not be of God. And so that's how I want to conclude with the challenge to be very careful in examining what it is that you're listening to. Even if something seems right when you first hear it, don't automatically accept it until you first filtered it through the light of Scripture, right? Number two, even if someone says something that seems true, don't automatically believe it until you've prayed and asked for God to give you wisdom. Because even Christians who love God and know the Lord, it's easy for us to get trapped by a lie, because sometimes those lies confirm what we want to believe, but they're not necessarily true. And so stay true to God. Don't bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's statue. And remember, Satan is smart. And it's easy to laugh at some goofball on TikTok, but the real influencers, the dangerous ones, are much more insidious, and it's hard to recognize them. And so we need to be on our guard that we're serving God and putting Him in first place.